Welcome to this episode of our podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Bishop.
Hello.
Dan is our Head of Systems and Cloud Transformation at York University. And Dan, York's been a big part of your life.
It has, yeah. It wasn't supposed to be, actually. York was my backup choice uni. I was hoping to go to Imperial in London, missed out on a few marks. I'd put York down as my backup because it just seemed so friendly when I went there. It was very, very different to a London university, but it was a little bit too close to home. I'm from the northeast, so I kind of wanted to get away from parents, move down south somewhere, that kind of thing. But ended up at York, studied physics. And then fell in love with the place. Turns out it's a really nice place to live. So ended up working for the Students' Union straight after uni. Did 3 years with them. Got a job in Leeds, but stayed living in York. And then another year after that, ended up working for the university, and I've been there ever since, and that was 2014, so about 9 years now.
All right. I mean, York is kind of entranced in British history, isn't it? You know, from Roman times right up to now. You're very close to, the kind of cutting edge technology that, helps run a university these days. So, I mean, as a parent of somebody who's at university now, some might be forgiven for thinking that universities today might be considered more private sector. But actually, there's only a handful, I think, in the UK that actually are. Yeah. Most are, of course, the public sector. So what's different about being in public sector to private sector, do you think, from a career point of view?
I mean, the obvious one's the salary.
Sure, yeah.
But aside from that, I think you have to offset that lower salary with other things. So we tend to have a much better leave allowance. We tend to have pretty good pensions. Some would argue that's not the case anymore, but they're still a lot better than a lot of my friends. But also it's more about that kind of motivation and why you're there and what you're doing. The universities are the cutting edge of research across all sorts of different things, from Icelandic cartography to medical research. Amazing. To just such a variety of things. And if you're working in IT in a bank and it's all about numbers and customers and numbers and customers, it's not the same as walking into a lab to fix someone's machine and seeing this amazing experiment set up. And it's that person's life's work. They're very passionate about it. And so you end up in a lot of conversations with academics who just want to tell you all about their projects and what they're doing. And it's a fascinating place to work.
Yeah, and you and I both go back to a time when IT in university life was just beginning. Really, we were talking earlier this morning about email had just arrived and the internet had just arrived. And from a research point of view, the internet opened up this whole new world of information that before that, it would have been trying to find books in the library on the subject. So what else are you seeing today in that kind of university environment, or whatever discipline an undergraduate or a lecturer might be in that as I say is a challenge from an IT point of view?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, as you've just said, obviously this is something that came in 20, 30 years ago, started to become a really big thing, and universities didn't always handle that very well. So where maybe other businesses would have had to have a central IT team that provides all of those services and builds on them and that kind of thing, you have a lot of people in a university who are very technical people who know a lot about IT. We have a whole computer science department. They're doing research and developing those new technologies. So departments went off and did a lot of their own things. So we've got lots of random pockets of things across the university that have become this sort of entrenched legacy business critical system that's been written by somebody in a very different way to how we would do it now. And I think York only really started properly centralizing IT maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and sort of taking that departmental concept away, bringing things into this central piece so that we've got one team working the same way, same processes, not duplicating effort, but without losing that kind of personal touch. So there's a lot of departments out there that are doing very technical work, and they're used to having staff embedded in their department who've built these systems and know how they work. So you can't just walk in there, take that down and say, no, you're using this now. Yeah. And they haven't got that support. Yeah. They haven't got that thing. It stops them doing their research. which is where one of my previous roles came from, the head of faculty IT. That was about bringing those teams that sat out in departments together, so they're all working in the same way. They're managed by central IT, but they still sit out in the departments. They still know what kind of research is being done, how it works, how classrooms are set up for teaching, all the sort of nuances that if you just had one central team, they wouldn't necessarily understand that and be able to deliver the same service.
I mean, one of the big things that changed that we were talking about earlier, in my day, I was telling you about, we had a room of about 30, kind of PCs, big bits of kit, 2 foot deep kind of monitors, and you had to time it right to be able to get access to one of those. The concept of the cloud hadn't been born. You couldn't toddle off back to your halls of residence or your house and log in from home. So in terms of the demand on that infrastructure that's there now, it can come from so many different places now. What sort of challenges does that present? For people like, for instance, who are like bring your own device rather than as I say, a pre-approved hardwired piece of kit back in our day.
Yep. So it's been an interesting one, that. So as you say, we used to have sort of very closely knit, tight, controlled environments. So you'd have a room full of PCs and you'd have some desktops in people's offices. And it was quite easy to manage that from a security point of view. It's quite easy to manage that from a sort of end user experience point of view. And then kit became more ubiquitous. It's a lot cheaper. You've got Raspberry Pis cropping up all over the place where people are playing with things. You've got smartphones, tablets. Everyone has their own laptop. So it places massive demands on the network. Wi-Fi has become a huge thing. We're very much going down a kind of Wi-Fi first route now, because everyone needs to be doing video calls from wherever they can find a room on campus, and it's a big piece. Yeah, so we're going through a big program at the moment called, it was called Managed Devices, changed to Assured Devices. I think we're back to Managed Devices, but it's this whole sort of cybersecurity piece. So it's very difficult. You need to allow people to do what they need to do, which in researchers' case can be very low-level things. Again, if you're in CS, you've got people doing low-level hardware design, people writing kernels, people doing all sorts of things where they need low-level access. But you've also got an awful lot of people who are doing administrative work or even just doing research that predominantly uses a web browser. And we don't want them just doing whatever they want. We want that to be a controlled, tightly closed environment. It's a big issue with things like cybersecurity insurance. There's been a number of large universities over the last few years who've had big cyber attacks, and it's wiped them out for days or even weeks. They haven't been able to do anything, and we don't want to be one of those. And I think so far we've avoided that largely through luck. It's not because York was in such a better position than those other universities. We just didn't happen to be the one that got hit. So there's a big drive right now to make sure we're not the one that gets hit, and really push for that sort of cybersecurity piece and assured devices. And you can bring your own device, but it will have to meet certain requirements. It has to have a patched, up-to-date OS and all those sorts of things.
So let's talk a little bit about scale in terms of the University of York. So in simple terms, how many users might you need to look after at any one point in time? And how does that kind of extend further into, you touched on it just there, around device management? Yeah,
so number of users at York is always a really complicated question. It shouldn't be, but it is. So we have roughly 100 and something thousand accounts.
Wow.
An account would normally relate to a person, but we have around about 20,000 students, 5,000 staff. But then you have a lot of people who we tend to call associates internally. So it might be external examiners, it might be researchers from other organizations that are coming to work with us, from all over the world as well, not just within the UK. So you have a lot of people with access to some level of our resources. So it's a really hard thing to scale. Again, one of the things that we did a long time ago was sort of write our own identity system to handle these complicated concepts. We're now paying the price for that because it's a kind of old legacy system that a handful of people know how it works. Time to take it apart now, yeah. It's time to replace it. There's another big project to fix that. And I think for a long time, York has thought that York is special and it's not like any other business. There's some element of truth to that in that universities are quite odd. But York's no different to most other Russell Group universities or research-led universities. That it has all these same concepts. Someone can be a member of staff and a student at the same time. It's very common. And modern IDM systems can handle that. It's not that complicated, really. But when you've got a lot of legacy things to deal with, that is an issue.
Yeah, I think probably people in private sector can relate to that as well. I mean, the pace of change now is so fast, isn't it? And certainly I can relate to that. It comes to a point where, right, how was it we did that? We need to pick that apart. have we got access to all of that? Is the person still here that wrote it originally?
Yes.
Right. All right. So we can all relate to that one.
Exactly that.
Yeah. And as I say, it's an element of testing. Then it's kind of, let's try and break this thing, which can often extend to months. There's some that would just, why can't we just have it tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
But it's the scale of things that can go wrong as well, isn't it? That you mentioned there, just in terms of we want to be at that. We don't want to be subject to a cyber attack.
No, absolutely.
So you can never do enough. So in terms of picking apart legacy systems, what sort of periods of time might you then sort of actually test before you set something like live, just to give an idea of the sort of like scope of some of the projects you've been working on?
Yeah, so I mean, it really depends what it is. So something we've had quite a lot of success with. So I used to lead a development team called the faculty development team, who was, again, it was part of that faculty IT piece where we sat out in departments. So we worked directly with admin staff, research staff in any given department, and we develop a solution for them. So again, they've gone off and done lots of custom things. They had their own custom clocking in and out systems. It's the university, again, it can be quite a strange place. So like things like flexi leave or even annual leave policies and things aren't necessarily consistent across the whole university. Different departments have different rules. So then they've written their own custom systems to manage that, rather than this one central sort of HR system that does everything.
Yeah.
So one thing we worked with one of the departments on was this sort of flexi leave system where staff can request leave and the manager approves it and all that sort of thing. Hooks into all the central databases, got it working for one department. Then you go to a second department and go, right, we've got this thing, have a play.
Yeah.
What doesn't it do? This, right, great. And once you've got it working for 2 or 3 departments, you can get enough momentum to go to the rest of them and say, you now need to change your processes to fit this system, rather than us try and build this really complicated system that can accommodate 28 different processes across 28 different departments. Let's start streamlining some of this stuff. It should be simple, and it can be simple. We just need to do that piece by piece bit of work to get the impetus and make it really happen.
So we talked earlier about you've got 20,000 students, 5,000 kind of staff in there. What's the size of your team to support all of those guys, that are actually kind of always there full time, before you start to need to think about, okay, well, who else might we need to work with outside of the organisation?
Yeah, sure. So across IT as a whole, I think we're looking at around about 180 staff at the moment, something like that. And it's kind of divided into 3 streams. So we have our digital stream. So they do a lot of things like enterprise system type stuff, integrations to make some of these things talk to each other. So everything from student databases to application portals and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And the bigger pieces like payroll software and all that kind of thing. And then we've got our infrastructure stream, which is where I sit. And so that looks after everything from DNS and DHCP to the network itself to Linux servers, Windows servers, virtualization, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And then the last one is our newest stream, which is our customer engagement, I want to say it's called.
Okay.
Someone's going to kill me if I've got that wrong now. But it's essentially our kind of support desk function, and also our kind of desktop and print services and that kind of thing, and making sure that they actually match up with what the end user wants. So end users notice if printers don't work or if their laptop doesn't do what they need it to do. They don't really understand what DHCP and DNS is, and they shouldn't need to. So that's kind of been filtered off into a separate bit that is very much about making sure we're meeting those customer demands.
So it sounds as if along that strand of customer engagement, which is commonplace in private sector as well, measuring yourself against the expectations of customer in terms of response time, resolution time. So presumably there's quite a few tickets raised each day for a whole variety of things, I'm sure that everybody can relate to.
Yeah.
So that processing power in terms of humans and first line and second line and where does that go is completely relatable to kind of private sector. So we've kind of joked even about last 25, 30 years and how's that changed. What about in the last 5 years? And what do you think's coming up in the next five years, if you care to place a bet?
Sure. So I'd say the biggest piece for us really in the last 5 years has been COVID. it changed absolutely everything about the way we work. It changed the way we taught, the way we did research. It was a fundamental shift, as it was for lots of people across lots of sectors. The whole world changed. But yeah, it was a particular challenge. So we have a lot of international students. They couldn't come to York necessarily. Even once that was okay. So China makes up a big base of our student intake. Even once Chinese students were allowed to come to the UK, there were no flights to bring them. In fact, we had to band together with some other universities to charter planes to bring students from China to the UK to be able to come to the university. But that whole piece for staff as well, the working from home, we had a lot of people who would come to the university every single day, 5 days a week, sit at their desk with a desktop PC. Great. Suddenly, everyone has to be at home. Everybody needs a laptop. Laptops were not commonplace at the university. You had to justify why you'd need a laptop. Yeah. Otherwise, you're sat at a desk. Why don't you have a desktop?
Yeah. And then there was the challenge of actually getting them.
Exactly. Yeah. Huge problem. Yeah. Supplier parts. I mean, we're still looking now at sort of 54-week lead times on switches and things. We're going to have to stockpile things and hope nothing breaks because we still can't get some of the things that we need. It was all a bit of a nightmare, but the end result I think has been very positive. It's made the university a much more flexible place to work. Now anyone can work from home in pretty much any role they're doing, which has really changed things, especially in IT.
It was a game changer, wasn't it?
It was a game changer.
In every way, shape and form. And while you were just talking there, I just kind of had a bit of a flashback to the Open University, right? Which was kind of more centered around television and broadcasting in that way. So it wasn't actually that different. It's still just accounting for the way people might want to consume, content or study or engage differently, all powered by, as I say, an increasingly kind of cloud infrastructure.
And that kind of thing is something York was already looking at. It's a bit of an untapped sector for a lot of traditional universities. So we're running sort of big online master's courses now. I think we have about 2,000 students across, there's only 2 of them. There's a cybersecurity one, I think, or something in computer science. And another one, I can't remember which department it is that's running it. But yeah, they've been really, really successful. It was something we were hoping to tap into. We tried it. It's been very, very successful. They start a new cohort of those every 2 months now, which again places additional demand on things. So universities typically have worked on a very obvious sort of timetable throughout the year. York, until very recently, has been a sort of 3-term university. So we know exactly when teaching is going to happen. We know when things are going to shift to more of a research focus. We know when rooms will be available to refit classrooms and that kind of thing. And then suddenly you're doing this teaching every 2 months, a new intake of students starts, and that places more demand on things. So we've started looking at things like AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, to be able to provide remote desktops to students to be able to access the various bits of software that we have site licenses for, or that are expensive niche pieces of academic software that we can't necessarily just give to them to install on their own device, but we can create this environment that they can log into remotely, all cloud hosted. They get access to all the tools they need. It's all configured for them, and they can just start learning rather than having to mess about with configuration.
It sounds like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it might be a little bit different to the private sector then, that you may get huge peaks and troughs in demand for certain services, and even simple things like just the concept of bandwidth. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think it would be,
Yeah, and so I wanted to sort of drill into a little bit, because I know that you've worked with Synapse, who are part of the Manx Telecom group in terms of IT cloud and managed services. I was really interested to know, well, how did you find Synapse? How did you come across them in the first place?
It's a good question. I actually inherited Synapse, if you will. So my predecessor, who was in this role, he left, and he'd already started talking to Synapse, and they were looking like a potential solution, but the team who was going to be working on this project weren't as keen. They were more focused on a very more obvious cloud solution like AWS, Azure, something like that. And so I kind of came in with a fresh pair of eyes, talked to various people, came to Synapse, had a look at the solution, and it solved some problems that we just couldn't solve with AWS and Azure. chiefly actually getting data into this system. So we've been working with Synapse to produce this disaster recovery backup system. So obviously we've got a lot of data at the university, research data that is people's life's work. And there's a lot of regulatory stuff there. Some of the grants that people get to do this research require that you keep certain bits of data for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
And we have 2 data centers on campus, and data is replicated between the 2. But that's still all on campus. And if something went really wrong on campus, it's gone.
Yeah.
So we were looking for some sort of cloud backup solution. Where can we put all this stuff? And whilst AWS and Azure and others provided object storage that would have worked really well for this from a kind of, we just want this easy to expand, let's just push data up into the cloud point of view, there were 2 big issues. One was cost, very expensive because of the amount of data we're looking at. And the other was actually getting it up there. It turns out that the tools that were available to go, right, we've got this huge archive of stuff here, and it changes every single day by X amount of terabytes, and we want to keep it all up in the cloud. It just didn't work. We did loads and loads of tests. I think we used about 20 different tools. We worked with vendors, and we just kept finding things would hang or they would just break, and we'd speak to vendors and they just didn't know what to do. They weren't used to working with the sort of data that we had. There's not a lot of duplicate stuff on there. There's a lot of really random things. There's just vast quantities of things. We've got lots of little files, lots of big files, lots of just really, really varied data sets. And none of this software would really work. Whereas the Synapse solution was just using this Isilon to Isilon link, which we were already using on campus to sync the data between the 2 data centers.
Yeah.
We're just syncing it to a third one, and it works.
And would that be typical of, I mean, we talked earlier about the various different faculties, each of which have different types of demand.
Yeah.
Would that be typical of most universities, would you say?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. So the big data producers are the obvious ones. So your science departments, basically. Physics in particular just burns through data like there's no tomorrow. But yeah, your science departments generate a lot of stuff generally, and it is very, very varied. We have an HPC facility called Viking. So that came online about 5 years ago now. It's just due to be replaced. That has allowed people to do a lot more number crunching, a lot more working with big sets of data. And it's been a really, really good thing for the university. I think it's acknowledged across the university that this was a really good investment. But we need somewhere to put all of this data, and we need to keep it safe. And that's what this solution allowed us to do.
And do you find that, there's all different ways you can think about, do we want, partners that are huge in scale and have got massive amounts of resource, or ones that are smaller and more nimble, and what's kind of stood out for you in terms of, those things about Synapse that have helped you overcome your pain points and challenges?
It's a good question. So I think I've had a varied level of experience across all of those different types of suppliers. So sometimes you get the big obvious ones like Google or AWS, and they're actually very good, and they will work with you, and they've got experts in-house who will come and sit with your team and do things, and it's a really positive experience. And then other times the exact same company can fail to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas Synapse has been this sort of consistent group of people we keep working with, and it's been a very kind of start to finish. We introduce you to who's going to be doing this solution, solving it from our side for you, and they're there at the end of a phone or email or Teams or whatever else, here on the Isle of Man now. And it's been quite positive from a kind of relationship point of view, that you can just get to the same team over and over again, whereas you don't always get that with bigger solutions. And certainly once something is finished and wrapped up, you never see those people again, and you're dealing with the support side of it. And it's, again, a very different team and a very different experience usually. Geography
is an interesting sort of subject to touch on, isn't it? Because the world was once a very big place, before air travel, nowadays in IT terms, you can be anywhere in the world. We were talking about your student access from China earlier. It really doesn't play the same role that it perhaps once used to.
No, absolutely. Yeah. We have a large international student base, and it does present challenges. So we're a Google university. We use G Suite for all of our email and calendaring and that sort of thing. And when Chinese students return to China, either for the holidays or over the summer or whatever, they can't necessarily access our services anymore. And that's a big problem, especially during things like COVID. If something happens and you need to be able to communicate with students, but the platform you're using is blocked in their country, that's a problem. We have partnered with some people in China to provide a VPN link that allows students to access our resources now, but through a sort of Chinese government approved route. But it does present a lot of challenges. And there's a whole bunch of things that we could be doing in various parts of the world, but then latency becomes an issue, or data law becomes an issue. We can't just stick our data anywhere. It's strictly governed, and rightly so.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is a big world, but also in an IT world, sometimes it's not, because you have some very tight restrictions that you need to follow.
I've come across exactly the same, where you can put your data. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I'm just wondering, while students can access from anywhere in the world, and within, as you say, kind of restrictions, you can deal with partners potentially anywhere in the world, house your data in the world. What's the situation like in the public sector today in terms of competing with private sector for IT talent? Right. So, is that overcome by as I say, the anywhere in the world concept, or are you constantly fighting with higher salaries in private sector?
We're definitely fighting with higher salaries in the private sector. I think again, this really ties back to COVID. So, one of the nice selling points about York is that it's a lovely city to live in. And we had a lot of people working for us who could have gone and got high-paid jobs in London, but didn't want that London lifestyle, and were happy to take the salary cut, live in York. It's cheaper than London. It all kind of works out. Everyone's happy. COVID happened. Remote working became a thing for everybody. Suddenly, they can take those London jobs with their London salaries, but still live in York, which is what they always liked.
Yeah.
And we can't compete with that. They're suddenly being paid 2 or 3 times as much money, and we just can't compete. So we've really got to look at how else we sell working at the university. It's not just about living in York. That's lovely, but it's about that piece about being surrounded by that research, seeing what the university does, being part of that, supporting things that aren't just, the banking sector, or something that to me would be a little bit more dull and not something I could be passionate about. And you've got to get staff, and certainly potential staff, to realize what it is the university does, why it exists, get them out there in departments, get them meeting people, talking about these things and wanting to find solutions to research problems, rather than just, it's a generic IT role.
It's been interesting, hasn't it, post-COVID? I think, we to some extent, part of society enjoyed that, hang on, the world's all of a sudden a lot quieter, and for some that was quite nice. For others, that was one of the biggest challenges. What we're saying in private sector now is that return to work comes with sets of challenges as well. Some people actually want to have that kind of hybrid or still fully remote work from home, which creates some challenges when, as I say, somebody can live in York but still claim a London salary. What are you seeing within the university in terms of people coming back to work, human to human again? Is there more of a shift towards that now? Is it kind of sat as hybrid or other extreme?
It's definitely sat as hybrid. So it does vary from department to department. Obviously, we have roles where you can't necessarily work remotely. I mean, the university is like a small city. We have chefs and cleaners and gardeners, and every job you could name, there's one of them at the university. And some of those roles obviously have to be on campus. Most IT roles can be done remotely. But then one of the big challenges is, as I said, we've lost a lot of staff to some of these things, higher salaries, different roles, etc. We have managed to replace some of them, but then you have all these new staff who are working remotely, and it's really hard to build a team. And bringing people onto campus, even just to sit together and not even be working on the same thing necessarily, but just that kind of water cooler conversation that just used to happen naturally, and you'd meet people and you'd find out about what was going on. That's really, really difficult when everyone's working from home. I wouldn't say we've solved it yet, to be honest. I'm not sure there is a one-size-fits-all solution.
No, I'd say the same. There are different preferences, and it's trying to account for more preferences now and maintain the productivity. Just touching on social then, Does somebody like your university have an environmental and social governance policy? Is that high on the agenda?
Yeah, it's a huge part of our strategy for 2030. So things like being carbon neutral by 2030, being university for the public good, that's a huge thing. So there's lots of things we want to do as part of that. Getting people from the local area into the university to understand what it's actually doing, getting kids from underprivileged backgrounds to see that they can come to university, they can do these things where they might not have otherwise been exposed to it. It's a massive part of what the university does.
It's same in private sector.
Mm-hmm.
I think, as I was saying earlier, that kind of period where we were in isolation, it gave you a kind of chance just to think about things that you might not ordinarily in the kind of, the cycle of life. So certainly in private sector, carbon neutral, particularly important, and particularly important for our customers as well. And I imagine students' choices as well.
Yeah.
It may affect their decision as to where they went.
It is. We're seeing that's becoming ever more a thing. 10, 15 years ago, nobody would even really know what it meant. It wasn't a big deal. No one was talking about it. Students certainly weren't considering it. And now students are very environmentally conscious. It's a big deal. And we need to be as employers and as a university. So
yeah. Well, Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today and sharing the insights
Likewise.
from York. Thank you for taking the time with us. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Many more to follow. And if you've got any sessions, do just drop us a message anytime. Thanks and see you soon.